The debate on changes to superannuation tax continued today with attacks and denials of broken promises. Allegra Spender is the independent MP for Wentworth, a former Liberal stronghold and one of the wealthiest constituencies in the country. Prior to entering Parliament in 2022 as a Teal independent, Spender worked in business, in consulting and some years ago as a policy analyst in the UK Treasury. I spoke to her earlier. Allegra Spender, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you so much for having me.
This change on super appeared to come out of nowhere. How do you think the government has handled it?
Look, I think that this is an opportunity to have a conversation about super in a broader sense, and I'm afraid we've ended up with something super narrow. And I think in my community there's a concern that we're just going to come back to it in a few years' time. My community is more open to it than you would think, perhaps, being one of the more wealthy communities of the country. But there is this concern that this is just a short-term fix, and the big hole that Chalmers identified of $50 billion isn't really closed.
So what's wrong with it? The fact that it came piecemeal, is that what you object to, that it's just a small bite?
Look, I think that we've lost an opportunity to have a bigger debate. And I think there's a bigger debate to be had about super, but there's a bigger debate to be had about how do we raise taxes. One of the things people coming back to me are saying, well, why isn't the government looking at these other taxes or these other ways of raising money? And that's what happens when there's a sort of piecemeal approach. I think that we need to take a step back and say, what is the tax system in the long term that will suit our economy, and how do we best get there? And that's what I'm going to be doing in a roundtable later this month.
Now, your electorate was, of course, a strong Liberal stronghold.
Yeah.
Now, today's Liberals, though, have jumped all over this as a broken promise. Do you think that pushing it beyond the next election has neutralised that issue?
I think it has, actually. I think, people will have a chance to vote on it, and I think in that sense they have, managed, I think, that pretty cleverly.
Now, are you surprised, however, that the government was prepared to take what is still quite a big risk for a relatively small reform?
I am surprised, and I think it's a missed opportunity. I would love, we have not had big reform conversations. This election that we just had was about saying how can we promise to touch things as least as possible. And to be honest, the political point scoring and gotcha from the media, I think has made, some of our elections very timid. And I do think we need to have some big debates, and it's time to start doing that.
In relation to tax reform, you have talked about the consideration for a new mining tax, but for the next generation of mines, for rare earth minerals. Shouldn't we be also considering a mining tax? Shouldn't have we been considering a mining tax, given the massive profits that the resource sector has been making?
Look, I am open to considering a sort of mining tax or a super profits tax. Mining companies and companies in general, they want certainty. They don't like ambiguity. I think that if you brought in something like that, you consulted the industry, they might not like it, but they can still make the investments if they believe the government's not going to change their mind over time. And I think, we're living through the price spikes of gas and coal, where the Australian taxpayer just really didn't get the benefit of those high prices for our resources. I think says that we are missing a trick there. So I definitely think that should be on the table in any sort of consideration of our long-term tax mix.
I just want to go back to your constituency for a moment. People would assume, as you say, because it's a very wealthy electorate, that people would be angry about this tax move. Is that what you have heard from your constituents?
No, it's actually there's much more support than you would think. We've got a big survey out there, so if you're a member of Wentworth, please get on and complete the survey. And I think, people, there's much more support, to be honest, than there is, concern. But people do have the concerns that if someone's already retired and that close and they've made plans, how is it going to affect them? They are concerned. They do want, private sector people to be treated the same as public sector defined benefit pensions. And then finally, they do want the government to be saying, well, are you going to come after us for other things? What's your long-term plan in relation to tax and spending?
You said before that you want to get away from the idea of gotcha which makes people timid during elections. The issue of capital gains tax on the family home was raised. And in the information that came out yesterday, it's clear that capital gains tax is a much larger concession than the one we're looking at in relation to superannuation. Is that a legitimate argument, the sustainability of capital gains tax?
Look, I'm trying to put everything on the table and not preempt a round table because, I am not the only person who has a view on tax, and I'm trying to open the discussion. I have a personal view in terms of capital gains tax, to be honest, on the home, which I don't think we should be changing. But I think that if we are going to have real reform discussions, we need to have some controversial views on the table, and to be able to have an open conversation without trying to rule everything out. Because you rule out, and then media, and I'm sorry, will complain, oh, everyone's so timid. You actually have to allow people a space to have a reform discussion.
All right, let's talk about the safeguard mechanism, because that is obviously the government's signature climate policy. Now, you're introducing an amendment in relation to the way offsets will work. That is the way that companies will be able to deal with some of their emissions that they haven't been able to bring down. What is it that's wrong with what the government is proposing? What are you trying to change?
Look, the government's put a $75 cap on the cost of offsets that a company could use to offset their emissions. I have two views on offsets. The first is that we can't use unlimited offsets. Kazakhstan, I think, is the only other country in the world that allows the unlimited use of offsets. We actually need to mitigate and change our behaviours if we are going to deal with climate prices. But the second piece is that, if it costs more than $75, the company who's polluting should pay for it. We want to sharpen the incentives so that people invest to reduce emissions. That is the only way out of this climate crisis.
And what sort of conversations are you having with the Greens, with David Pocock, with Jackie Lambie about this?
Look, we're having conversations about, the crossbench, in the House and in the Senate, because, there are a lot of good, I think, potential amendments flying around right now, because, the safeguard mechanism is crucial legislation. It is very important that we pass it, but it can be better. And I think, many of us are fighting on this and, working together where we can.
Now, you spent some time around government in the past, but you've come into the Australian Parliament. Your expectations versus what it's been like? We're not quite at your first year yet, but...
I've got to say the biggest disappointment for me is question time, because it is funny. I mean, sometimes it's actually quite hilarious, but I think it's a complete waste of time. I think there is no expectation that someone on the government will answer a question the way that a normal person would expect a question to be answered. And it feels very performative. And so I think that's the biggest opportunity. We're all in the room. It's, a lot of politicians in one space. We're wasting Australian taxpayers, money, basically, playing games with each other. So I'd like to see a much more serious policy debate there. Otherwise, it's been fun.
New question time from Allegra Spender. Thank you very much indeed for coming into 7:30.
Thanks so much for having me.